Thank you very much. I'm going to give the floor to Vroni Lemeire, but I'm going to let Inge introduce her. So Vroni has been a political project leader and in charge of promoting gender equality in her trade union. She works in close collaboration with the Women's Committee, Eliane Vogel-Polski, who had been a lawyer and a pioneer in gender equality. This committee, Eliane Vogel-Polski, really is composed of members from different organizations. They deal with issues such as equal pay, gender equality, women policies. She's very active with MOOC, and she was interviewed and she has heard a number of witnesses. Thank you very much, Inge, for those kind words of introduction. And thank you for all those who created MOOC. It's a wonderful initiative, and thank you for organizing this meeting with the social partners and with the trade unions in particular, because I know that all too often we think of the employers, but trade unions also play a very important role in this fight. And I hope that through this presentation you will understand why getting the trade unions involved is so important. We have already seen this in the first presentations. Sexism is something, the consequences of sexism can be felt at personal level. We've seen the case of this lady who was working as a domestic worker, but there has been a U2 study or survey that was conducted, which revealed that women are primarily the victims of sexual intimidation and sexual harassment. So when you're starting in life, it has a terrible impact on your career, on your attitude to work. There are individual consequences, but also collective, because it's a violation of human rights, and it's also a negation of equality between men and women. The fame of the company, the organization, the sector is also important. You know, the trial against Yann Fabre is definitely something extremely bad for his company, and Sforza and all of those examples that have been mentioned in the press. No company really wants to be in the eye of the cyclone, in this case, in the eye of the typhoon, and initiatives need to be made within the organization and within the sector. This is an overview of my presentation, definition of sexism, framework of action, which is a trade union, a feminist approach, and how to fight sexism individually, collectively, and what we've been doing without our trade union and within the framework of social dialogue. So what is sexism? What is sexual violence? What is sexual harassment? Actually, all of those elements are the tip of the iceberg. There are many things, many clues that come before that. It's a sort of escalation, a slow escalation. We say all too often that it starts small with jokes, with an unhealthy climate, and there is a rapid escalation towards sexual innuendos and sexist language and violence even. I'm not going to repeat what Alicia said, but sexism is really based on inequalities, gender inequalities, and has economic consequences. But it's interesting to look at where those inequalities come from. Now, back in 2018, the Women's Committee Eliane Volsky organized a seminar around the legal context. You might remember Meet Smet campaign. It was a campaign saying sex colleague, ex-colleague. So that was to identify people who had inappropriate behavior. It was brand new at the time, this attitude, and it had quite a lot of success. In fact, a royal decree was adopted in 1992, and therefore the employer became responsible for preventative actions. And in this royal decree, it said very clearly that measures needed to be adopted together with trade unions. The fight against sexism and inappropriate behavior is really at the basis of the current framework as we know it, in terms of harassment at work in general, psychosocial well-being. You remember that there is a new piece of legislation that was adopted. Trade union delegates were part of that reflection group, and the idea was that by considering all the aspects of the theme, the specificity of sexual harassment got somewhat diluted. What the delegates had pointed out was that there was some difference in terms of practice between sexual violence and harassment. Sexual violence means that the person is going to feel upset and fragile, but it's a quite personal thing following a series of behaviors, because the perpetrators actually act together and have a specific approach. It is important, therefore, for trade unions to get involved early on. But what we have noticed is that things were quite fluctuating, because not all shop stewards were involved or were informed. And so what we pleaded for within the trade union was to pay more attention to these cases, so collectively speaking. And then the trade union feminist framework, how to deal with this. Collectively speaking, as Alicia was saying, we have a vast number of inequality cases, and Belgian trade unions in 2004 made a commitment in the gender mainstreaming, which is a political document, which is not an acquis, even though it was signed and has been reviewed. Actually, it is the result of our work as gender officers, gender equality officers, but we want this to be owned by everyone. And it is important to have this fit within a framework of values which we speak of internally. So it's the fight against inequalities, it's upholding diversity, and so on. I've been working now on the fight against racism. The Brussels Parliament has been working on this, and FGTB Brussels used to say, we want sexism to be treated on a par with racism. But when we attended sessions on racism at the Belgian Parliament, I realized that the problem of racism was just as huge as sexism. It is impossible to fight one without fighting the other. You can't fight that and not fight the rights of the LGBTI community, homophobia, and so on. So it's the fight against social discrimination and social differences. I wanted to show you this slide because I've been working for the Equality Department of FGTB, supported by Actiris. So we're promoting diversity in the trade union and in businesses. And the strength of FGTB, and it's probably the same for CSC, is the workers themselves who share the values. It is the diversity also of the activists who are part of our trade unions. And I must say that very often this is an uphill battle. I mean, it's never easy. You need to fight constantly. And so there is so much tension. You have the far right fighting us, and you're sending shop stewards in the field, and they're confronted with this organization in Ghent, Schild and Vriend, for instance. And in this period of time, many people have told us that people in companies feel that this is not a problem. So this is to say that there was opposition to what we were doing, and we were confronted with that. And actually, those values of solidarities and equalities needed to be upheld simply because they are repressed by a policy based on economics, on economic factors, and things other than the well-being, human well-being. Authorities feel that workers have nothing to gain from it. But when you are practicing inequality, lack of solidarity, and racism, nobody's winning. And so the charter that I was telling you about has been something really important since we signed it back in 2004. But we needed to make sure that it has an impact on the activities organized by the trade unions. In 2014, after being confronted with some incidents, FGTB Brussels and FGTB Wallonia decided to organize a campaign to fight sexism in order to also make sure that feminism would be better known by our activists, our trade union activists. So we had a campaign saying, I'm against sexism because, and here we called on several permanent representatives of the trade unions, and we created some posters, and they were heavily circulated. And you can see Thierry Baudson before he became the president, Mr. Tabellini, Vid Janssen also is there, president of the public service in Brussels. In other words, this was an important junction to fight sexism. And then there was another initiatives of the ETUC, zero tolerance. This was something about fighting violence. And today, all of the meetings of the ETUC start with a reminder of the Code of Ethics adopted by the ETUC. And in this code, we indicate what are the inappropriate, unacceptable behaviors, and that there is a procedure for lodging complaints. So this is the result of what we have been doing within the trade union movement. So how do we fight sexism at work? I believe the brochure that JUMP just published is extremely important. Of course, we need individual support. We need information about how to report and lodge a formal criminal complaint. So there are criminal consequences, and this has to be known. And of course, it's not just the victim who can do something. Witnesses, colleagues, and of course, top management should give the proper example. And here I'm referring to people who've been fighting for equality within the trade union. You know, this is a collective fight. We need to be in it together. And so what can we do collectively? We need to pay attention to comments which are made, especially disparaging remarks, gender-based attitudes. And then there is the social dialogue. Let me give you some example. There has been a campaign organized by FOS and FGTB, and this is actually an international campaign, because obviously it's not just in Belgium that we're confronted with sexism. Sexism is something that you find in all walks of life and in all countries. So this is a website which says you need to claim your rights, give us the tools to report those cases, and help the trade union help you. So what are the tools we can avail ourselves of? So this is to get our thinking caps on, to start thinking about the underlying factors. There are multiple discriminations: sexism, racism, precariousness, sexual preferences, and so on. So there was an example which I thought was extremely interesting, which came from the Nordic trade unions. In the catering sector, they wrote a report following a survey regarding risks in the catering industry in their countries. They had noted that the typical victim is the young woman working part-time in the catering sector. So they launched a campaign to raise awareness amongst the public at large. And then an example from Belgium and Europe. The European Trade Union Transport Federation has also embarked on this sort of campaign. So social dialogue is important. We pointed this out. In this sector of activity, women are a minority. They don't really have the possibility of going to the loo, for instance, and they are pretty vulnerable. So they have developed a real policy of fighting sexism at work. And then to conclude, this is something we have already referred to, the ILO convention. It's the Convention 190. Belgium has already a pretty good regulatory framework, but we believe that this particular piece of legislation, this convention, could further improve the existing framework in Belgium. So the Institute drafted a relevant text on this, and let me highlight one element of the convention which is important and which has to do with domestic violence. So this campaign was organized, and it was quite interesting for our work because Convention 190 clearly stated that violence, domestic violence, can also have consequences on the workplace. It said that the workplace can also play a role, a preventative role. So within the framework of the convention, we can pursue our effort. And the Secretary of State, Madame Benaou, referred to this because the workplace is not just the building itself, the venue, but it's also the journey to get to the workplace. And then on the 28th of November, not the 25th, as written here on this slide, we will have a special day. This is our group. And let me conclude with a copy of an article that was published and was a recap of my presentation. Sexual harassment and the fight against it at work is collective. A collective requires a collective approach, a collective flight. Look at Me Too. People needed to get together and all report what had happened. So we are a lot more efficient when we are together. Obviously, we need to encourage people to report, but women often fear the consequences, especially if they are at the beginning of their career. And many examples have already been mentioned, and I'm again referring to the trainee at the law firm. I conclude my presentation by saying that, again, this is a collective fight, hand in hand with the public authorities, with the employers, with the employers' federations, and I'm now giving you the floor, dear friend.